judge publicly disrespects Pam Bondi during court proceedings. Moments later, she secures him in handcuffs. "I have something unbelievable to share with you." Pam Bondi had faced pressure before. After years of navigating the complexities of the legal system and tackling some of the most challenging cases in the nation, today carried a unique weight. Upon entering the courtroom presided over by Judge Howard Gates, a figure notorious for his biting remarks and erratic decisions, she sensed that this would be anything but a routine hearing. The matter before us? An intense government ethics breach that could disrupt more than just a handful of careers. The accused was an affluent developer with significant political connections, charged with diverting state funds into his personal ventures. The proof was piled up, and Bondi was ready for the challenge. What she hadn't anticipated was the palpable hostility emanating from the bench before she uttered a single word. Judge Gates hardly raised her gaze as she neared the plaintiff's table. Instead, he turned the pages of a file with careful slowness, allowing the courtroom to remain enveloped in silence. The type of silence that transcended mere procedure, crafted intentionally to convey a powerful message. At last, he uttered his words without casting a glance in her direction. "Ms. Bondi, I trust you have something meaningful to share with us today? Or should we just move forward to the moment where you squander my time?" A soft wave of laughter echoed from the rear of the courtroom, primarily emanating from the defendant's legal team. Bondi turned a blind eye to them. She had encountered greater challenges. "Your Honor, I trust the evidence will convey its own message. This situation pertains to the improper use of public funds, and my responsibility is to guarantee that the details are conveyed with precision." Judge Gates reclined in his chair, pretending to be uninterested. Public funds, indeed, because that has never served as the basis for a trivial case in the past. Bondi's jaw clenched, yet her voice remained composed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I would not characterize felony corruption charges as trivial." In a fleeting instant, their gazes intertwined. His demeanor was frigid and methodical, hers steadfast. Just as she was about to proceed, he interrupted her once more. "Ms. Bondi, please save the lectures for someone else. Let's cut to the chase. I don't have endless time to indulge in whatever spectacle you have in mind." A whisper rippled through the gallery. The courtroom may not have been crowded, yet the individuals present were keenly aware, picking up on an unsettling atmosphere. Judges can be challenging, but this held a deep significance. Pam inhaled deeply, finding her center once more. She was aware of the unfolding events. Gates aimed to unsettle her. He aimed to dictate the rhythm, forcing her into a position of vulnerability. Yet she had no intention of granting him that pleasure. She grasped a folder from the table, deftly flipping it open. "Your Honor, I wish to draw the court's focus to Exhibit A. These financial records unmistakably illustrate." "Ms. Bondi," Gates interjected, "do you consistently demand that people wade through an ocean of paperwork? Or is this merely your method of making up for something?" That one hit the mark. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The defense attorney wore a sly grin. A handful of journalists in the gallery shared knowing looks. Yet Bondi remained unfazed. She had discovered long ago that figures like Judge Gates flourished through the art of intimidation. The sole method to overcome them was to ensure they never witnessed your composure falter. She lingered in silence, conveying a message that needed no words. She placed the folder on the table and brought her hands together in a gentle clasp. "Your Honor, should you wish to keep this matter personal, I am more than willing to request a recess to discuss any professional issues you might have." It was understated, neither confrontational nor disrespectful, yet clearly directed. A definitive signal that she wouldn't back down. The judge's lips curved ever so slightly. Was that laughter? Frustration? It was difficult to discern. Yet he had more to say. "Not at this moment." "Oh, I have no worries, Ms. Bondi. I can easily identify a flimsy argument when it presents itself." This time, the response was more than mere whispers. A couple of sharp intakes of breath. A quiet murmur escaped their lips. This was not the manner in which a judge ought to preside over a hearing. Pam sensed the atmosphere in the room changing, with gazes darting back and forth between her and Gates like a game of tennis. However, she had no intention of participating in a heated argument. That was his desire. Instead, she smoothed her blazer, organized a few papers, and met his gaze with unwavering intensity. In that case, it seems we ought to allow the evidence to speak for itself. Yet, as she spoke, she noticed a flicker in his expression. It's more than mere arrogance, more than simple condescension. There existed another element, a glimmer of a profound essence, as if someone had a personal investment in the result of this situation. And that was the moment she realized. This transcended mere courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates was not merely engaging in conflict for the sake of it. He was concealing a secret. Yet, unbeknownst to him, she was equally aware. Pam Bondi had faced numerous intense hearings in the past, but this one was entirely different. Judge Gates was more than a figure behind the bench. He engaged in a game, an intentional, strategic effort to discredit her before the whole courtroom. But what is the reason? She sensed the intensity of his gaze as she navigated her points. With each word she uttered, he was poised to strike. She could almost visualize it. The subtle curve of his mouth, the gentle rhythm of his fingers against the bench. It was as though he was challenging her to persist. She had no intention of halting. "Your Honor," she stated, maintaining a calm and composed tone. The documents reveal a distinct inconsistency in the allocations. The company of the defendant obtained almost 3 times the sum that was sanctioned in the initial budget, and there was no record of it in the state documentation. She shifted her stance, indicating the projection screen that showcased the financial statements. "Now, if you observe this, Ms. Bondi," Gates interjected, his tone laced with that familiar air of arrogance. "I regret having to interject during your presentation.
Truly, I do.
However, I believe we've encountered a sufficient amount of figures for today." Bondi cast a quick look at him before returning his gaze to the screen. He had stopped pretending altogether. "Your Honor, I respectfully submit that these figures are the cornerstone of our argument." Indeed, he let out a derisive laugh. "Nevertheless, I struggle to comprehend what could possibly warrant such a misuse of the court's time." There it stood. There it is once more.
Squandaring moments.
He was attempting to stifle this case before it had a chance to take flight. A gentle rustle reached her ears from behind, the subtle movement of the prosecution team as they shifted and exchanged glances. They sensed it as well. Something felt off. Bondi tightened her grip on her pen, turning to the next page in her file. "Your Honor, I respectfully request to submit a motion to deny silence." She raised her gaze. "The motion has yet to be articulated. And yet, I can already sense that it's heading towards a dead end." Gates inclined his body, propping his elbows on the bench. "Let's get real, Ms. Bondi. This whole situation relies on conjecture, a touch of imaginative bookkeeping, and now you're lamenting corruption?" The defense attorney, a man of middle age clad in a navy suit, wore a smirk on his face. He remained silent, not needing to utter a single word. Gates was handling all the tasks on his behalf. Bondi let out a slow breath. "Your Honor, are you denying my motion without considering its details?" A moment, a heartbeat stretched too far. "Then, I will no longer participate in this spectacle." The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from tense to something more palpable. It was a constant movement, with eyes flitting about and heads swiveling. Even the journalists in the back were jotting down notes with increased urgency. Bondi's eyes met those of a juror, a woman in her 50s clad in a dark blazer. The woman's brows knitted together, her lips sealed tight. She was not the sole observer. Arrogance has a way of drawing attention to itself. Bondi straightened her posture. "Indeed, Your Honor. Now, let's move on to the subsequent piece of evidence." She pivoted her gaze back to the screen, advancing to the next slide with a click. This document, acquired via a subpoena, reveals that Ms. Bondi's tone has shifted this time, presenting a different nuance. She paused, her gaze fixed on him. Judge Gates had straightened in his chair, the smug expression replaced by something more serious. His hands were tightly joined, his mouth a narrow, rigid line. A shift had occurred. Step forward to the bench. It was not a request. After a moment of uncertainty, she placed her papers aside and approached him. Silence enveloped the courtroom. As she approached the bench, he softened his tone, ensuring that only she could catch his words. I would highly recommend that you rethink the path you are pursuing, Ms. Bondi. She inclined her head ever so slightly. Beg your pardon? I'm suggesting, he whispered, that certain battles aren't worth engaging in. She allowed that moment to linger in the space between them. Then gradually, with intention, she inched closer by a mere inch. I'm not easily intimidated, Judge Gates. A muscle in his jaw quivered. She pivoted and made her way back to her table. Yet that instant revealed all she required to understand. Pam Bondi settled back into her seat, thoughts swirling in her head. That wasn't merely a display of power. It was a caution, a subtle menace cloaked in the guise of legal authority. But what is the reason? She had entered the courtroom anticipating resistance, perhaps even animosity, but what she encountered was something far more profound. Judge Gates wasn't merely biased. He was safeguarding something, or perhaps someone. She rearranged a pile of documents, maintaining a calm demeanor. The prosecution team beside her shifted, anticipation hanging in the air as they awaited her response. She hasn't, not at this moment. Instead, she raised her chin and confronted the judge. Your Honor, I would like to proceed with the presentation of my evidence. Gates remained silent for the moment. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, contemplating just how far he wished to go. Finally, go ahead, but make it concise. Bondi ignored the jab, her focus shifting as she reached for the next file. This document serves as a contract between the defendant and the city's planning board, detailing the expenses associated with the proposed project. The total of the listed costs comes to just over $2 million. She took a moment, then with careful intent, she positioned another sheet on the projector. Nonetheless, this document from the defendant's organization reveals that the true funds transferred were almost twice that figure. And here, she placed a third document down, revealing the approval signature, signed off by... She paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't merely shift, it splintered. A wave of activity, glances flitting, ink flowing. The defense attorney tensed, his self-satisfied demeanor vanishing. Judge Gates remained still. For the first time since entering this courtroom, his expression was a complete mystery. Bondi allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer before proceeding. Your Honor, could you clarify the presence of your signature on a financial transaction that was not authorized, which involves the defendant? A measured gamble. She lacked the complete narrative, yet the fragments she possessed were sufficient to unsettle the very ground he stood on. Gates finally stirred, adjusting his position in the chair, his fingers interlaced, knuckles turning pale. That document, he stated with deliberation, is inadmissible. Bondi inclined her head. In what way? It was acquired in an inappropriate manner. She allowed that to resonate. Your Honor, this document has been formally requested by my office. His nostrils expanded. Subsequently, it was poorly managed. I'm declaring it unacceptable. This court will not take it into consideration. This time, the transformation was not confined to the gallery. It permeated every corner, affecting the jury, the stenographer, and even the bailiff. All eyes were on the scene. Bondi crossed her arms, her voice steady and composed. Are you aware that this is a public hearing, right? Is the media present? Did everyone here just witness you dismiss crucial financial evidence as inadmissible without providing any justification? A muscle in his jaw twitched. That will be all, Ms. Bondi. She remained still, her eyes unblinking. Then, with a deliberate grace, she settled into her seat. And in that moment, she took an action that transformed everything. She delved into her case and retrieved a compact recorder. With a deliberate motion, she set it down on the table and hit play. A voice resonated through the courtroom, deep, rough, and unmistakable. Handle it with care. I have no concern for the method. The recording sputtered to life, then pressed on. Ensure that she doesn't obtain those ledgers. Stillness. An overwhelming, oppressive stillness. Judge Gates remained still, utterly silent. Bondi averted his gaze. There was no need for her to intervene. For now, every individual present had caught his words, and the true challenge was on the verge of unfolding. The recording concluded, resulting in an oppressive, heavy silence that enveloped the space. No murmurs, no whispered speculation, only the shocked, shared understanding that Judge Howard Gates had just been exposed. Pam Bondi remained still. Her gaze remained locked on the recorder, challenging him to dispute what had just unfolded. Yet he chose not to. He was unable to. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney finally faltered, his poise unraveling. The smirk had vanished, giving way to an expression that resembled dread. He cast a quick look at his client, the affluent developer whose empire had been constructed on clandestine agreements and political patronage. The man appeared ghostly. Judge Gates prepared to speak, clearing his throat with a deliberate pause. "Ms. Bondi, I am uncertain about the source of that recording, but that's not the question you ought to be asking, Your Honor," she interjected, her tone steady and resolute. "The true inquiry is, to whom were you speaking?" His fingers clenched into tight fists. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he exclaimed. "This whole hearing is spiraling into disorder due to your showboating." "Chaos?" Bondi echoed, her voice airy, tinged with a hint of amusement. "This represents clarity. At last, we are witnessing a glimpse of clarity in this courtroom." The tension escalated further. Bondi allowed the moment to linger, permitting him to feel the weight of his own perspiration. She extended her hand for another document, smoothly gliding it across the table. "Your Honor, this document is a transcript of a wiretap that was lawfully acquired in the course of our investigation." She gently wrapped her fingers against the upper edge of the page. "It confirms all that you just listened to in that recording." Judge Gates fixed his gaze on the page, yet refrained from making contact with it. His chest heaved with each breath, the sound of his inhalations growing more pronounced. Bondi shifted slightly, casting a glance at the bailiff. "Officer Reynolds, could you please read the highlighted section out loud?" The bailiff paused for a moment, then reached for the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the room feel smaller. "We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery. Bondi folded her hands together. "I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor." Judge Gates' eyes flickered toward the exit. A tiny movement, but enough. Enough for the room to realize that, for the first time, he was thinking about something other than his own arrogance. He was thinking about escape, but it was far too late for that. Motion denied, he barked. Bondi raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? This hearing is over," Gates continued, his voice a fraction too loud. "I will not allow." "Judge Gates," Bondi said smoothly, "I wasn't asking for your permission." And then she did it, the move she'd been waiting for. She glanced toward the rear of the courtroom and offered the faintest, most delicate nod. A door creaked open, and the sound of footsteps reverberated across the gleaming floor. Then, with a commanding presence, Judge Howard Gates declared, "You are under arrest." Gasping sounds filled the air from all directions in the room. Journalists scrambled for their devices. The sound of shutters echoed. The jury stared in astonishment. Even the defendant, the formidable figure who had anticipated this trial to be merely a formality, appeared truly taken aback. Judge Gates remained unmoved. He remained silent. He remained still, his gaze locked onto a solitary spot on the bench, as though he believed that by remaining motionless, he could will the world around him to vanish. Yet, the truth had inevitably caught up with him. Pam Bondi sat quietly while two uniformed officers stood beside the judge. One hand delved into a pocket, while the other revealed a pair of cuffs. "This is ridiculous," Gates murmured, though the struggle had already ebbed from his tone. The officer remained unflinching. One possesses the privilege to choose silence. For the first time in his career, Judge Howard Gates truly was The sharp clank of metal sealing echoed loudly. The cuffs clamped down on Judge Gates' wrists, marking the end of his reign before the very individuals he had governed for so long. The once authoritative presence behind the bench now remained motionless, his face a portrait of astonishment. The courtroom was filled with hushed whispers, a palpable sense of disbelief hanging in the air like a charged current. Journalists rushed to seize the moment, their pens flying across their notebooks. Even the jury, constrained by their obligation to uphold neutrality, couldn't conceal their astonishment. Pam Bondi remained in her seat, her expression inscrutable. This wasn't about boasting. This was not a matter of retribution. This centered on fairness. Judge Gates has at last discovered his voice. This isn't possible. His words emerged softly, nearly a whisper, as though he doubted their truth himself. The officer gripping his arm remained unyielding. Sir, you are being apprehended for hindering justice, plotting fraudulent activities, and misusing judicial authority. You will have the opportunity to consult with a legal professional. Gates strained against the restraints, his face turning red. This is utterly unacceptable. I hold the authority in this courtroom. Bondi finally rose, adjusting her blazer with a sense of purpose. That's no longer the case. His head jerked in her direction. For the first time, the haughtiness had given way to something different, something akin to trepidation. The officers lifted him upright, yet he fought against their hold. This has political implications. Bondi shook her head in disbelief. This represents responsibility. The atmosphere fell into a profound hush once more. A lifetime of unbridled authority extinguished in a heartbeat. Gates's expression contorted, his jaw tightening as he faced the audience. His gaze flitted from one face to another, seeking an ally, someone who would rise and proclaim this a blunder. Yet there was no movement, for it was not an error. A few feet away, the defense attorney had turned as pale as a sheet. The creator, the individual who believed his power could protect him, wasn't doing much better. His fingers clutched the table's edge, breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Bondi allowed her gaze to rest on him for a fleeting moment before redirecting her attention to the judge. Your Honor, she spoke with a voice that was calm and measured. If you have any thoughts to share, I recommend holding onto them for your arraignment. Gates's mouth parted, then closed, as silence enveloped him, leaving no words to express his thoughts. The officers started guiding him to the side exit, but just as they approached the door, the developer managed to speak up at last. Hold on, hold on. With a sudden movement, his chair scraped across the floor as he sprang to his feet, his eyes flickering back and forth between Gates and Bondi. This situation is spiraling beyond control. We can find a solution together. Bondi pivoted, raising an eyebrow in intrigue. Can we come to an agreement? The man gulped, clearly coming apart at the seams. Honestly, this sort of public display is unnecessary. Let's approach this with a sense of practicality. Bondi observed him intently for a brief moment, then she advanced a step. It appears you are feeling a bit anxious, Merlawson. His lips parted, yet silence enveloped him. She inclined her head. What could be the reason for that? He shook his head, letting out a forced chuckle. Feeling anxious? This is absolutely unbelievable. Do you really think Gates is guilty? Bondi allowed the question to linger in the atmosphere before responding. Are you? Stillness. The officers advanced once more, guiding Gates through the doorway. As the door closed behind him, an oppressive silence enveloped the courtroom, heavy and suffocating like a dense fog. This had evolved beyond a mere case. This marked the beginning of the end for a system that had enjoyed too much protection for too long, and Bondi was far from finished. She cast a fleeting look at the jury, then at the vacant seat of the judge, and finally at the defense table. It seems we have a trial to conclude, yet after the recent events, it was clear to everyone present that this was merely the start. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed, feeling almost buoyant, as though the burden of years of deceit had been abruptly removed. Judge Gates had been taken away in handcuffs, and the astonishment of the moment hung in the atmosphere like the last chord of a grand composition. Pam Bondi settled back into her seat, rearranging the documents laid out before her. The trial was still ongoing, but the most significant hurdle had just been cleared. Her gaze shifted once more to the defense table. Charles Lawson, the developer, had fallen into an unsettling silence. His typical self-satisfaction had given way to a demeanor that was chillier, more strategic. He continued to evaluate the extent of the destruction, pondering how much of his security had been torn asunder. Bondi could sense the gears shifting in his mind. In the absence of Gates on the bench, his legal team would be compelled to present the case based solely on its own merits, which were non-existent. She inclined her body just a bit. "Mr. Lawson, shall we proceed with today's agenda? Or would you rather engage in a discussion about a plea?" His jaw tightened. "This is an unjust pursuit." Bondi offered a subtle smile. "No, Mr. Lawson, this is fairness." He let out a derisive laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Do you really believe that one corrupt judge makes a difference? Do you really believe this signifies your victory?" Bondi took a moment before replying. Instead, she allowed the silence to linger, permitting the gravity of the moment to settle in. She concluded, "I believe it indicates that the system is still operational. No matter how strong one believes they are, the truth will inevitably find its way to them." Lawson let out a sharp breath, yet words eluded him. The judge's seat sat vacant, yet it held no significance. The matter had slipped from his grasp. The members of the prosecution team shared knowing looks, and one of Bondi's colleagues leaned closer. This could be an opportune moment to advocate for an agreement. Bondi contemplated it. She sensed the change in the atmosphere, the intensity of the jury's gaze, poised and expectant. They had just experienced an unforgettable moment, yet she was determined to ensure this concluded with a resounding declaration. She rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she began, then hesitated, making a quick adjustment to her words. "To the esteemed judge overseeing this case, I respectfully submit a formal request to advance with the introduction of additional evidence. In light of recent developments, it is evident that a comprehensive inquiry is necessary to uncover the extent of this corruption." A soft whisper spread across the courtroom. Bondi went on, noting that Judge Gates was merely a piece of the puzzle. "If my team can reveal this, it suggests there is much more to discover. Additional names, more individuals who believed they were beyond reach." She faced Lawson once more, "So I'll pose the question again. Do you wish to talk?" Lawson remained tense, his fingers drumming on the table's surface. He was contemplating his choices. At last, he let out a breath. "If I proceed, I seek assurance." Bondi gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It's time to speak up." The courtroom had transformed completely in just an hour. The equilibrium of authority had changed. The barriers that shielded the influential were beginning to fracture, and Pam Bondi had just delivered a message to all those observing. No one stands beyond the reach of the law. With the bailiff demanding silence and the trial set to proceed, the journalists at the rear of the room hurriedly worked to capture their narratives. This was more than just a typical case. This marked a pivotal moment in time, and it was merely the start of something greater.